You cannot play chess if you cannot play the endgame. That is a famous quote. Sounds dramatic? Maybe, but it is absolutely true. Every single Russian kid starts learning chess from the endgames, and I was not an exception. Why so? Because you need to understand where the game is going. What is the destination? What is the purpose? Otherwise, you're just moving pieces. In this video, you will learn some universal principles of playing in the endgame, as well as some must-known basic positions. The knowledge that will help you know when to trade, how to trade, and what is the end goal of your games. So that the next time you reach the endgame, you will not be guessing, you will know. And for your convenience, I have added timestamps below, so feel free to skip around or rewatch anything you need. Let's dive in. So where does the endgame begin? Well, exactly here. Look at this position, right after trading the queens. Yes, that's true. Queen takes d8 and king takes d8. We are in the endgame, even though none of the pieces is actually developed. Isn't that crazy? Yes, that's called a multi-piece endgame. So basically, an endgame begins anytime you trade the queens, or if you trade all other pieces, but there are only queens on the board, then it's just a queen endgame. What is the right thing to do in the endgame? There is a golden rule. Actually, there are 5 golden rules. And rule number 1 is always bring the king to the center. The king is the most important piece in the endgame. So your plan is gonna be to activate the king early. Basically, as soon as it's safe, you should bring it towards the center. Like here, for example, king f2, king f8, king e3, king e7, king d4, and we already got the pawn. An interesting thing to mention is that in this idea, oftentimes beginners tend to think that they can promote a pawn and just randomly push b4. Not only this move loses because of our favorite en croissant. If you don't know what's that move, you can check out my video about the chess rules. Pawn takes b3. Or even easier than that, black can just simply promote their pawn and it's gonna be faster than white. Let me show you. c3, b5, c2, b6, c1, queen. Your plan in any endgame is always gonna be to bring the king towards the center, to activate your king early. Let's see another example on how you can activate the king. In this position, for example, you think that, white has an extra pawn. We have a pawn majority, therefore we should be able to promote. No, it's not that easy, because you cannot really create a pass pawn here. Actually, you can by playing g3, but you would lose the game because of a beautiful tactic that we're gonna study later if you guys want to have a video on the endgames, such as pawn breaks. Sacrificing the pawn, doesn't matter which pawn you take, I would still promote the h pawn. Either you take here and I take this one and I promote, or you take this one and then I push and then I promote faster. Therefore, the right plan, as usual, is gonna be to bring your king to the center, and the correct move would be king c2, king c7, king d3, king d6, king e4, king e6, f4, creating a pass pawn, and white wins. Rule number 2. The king is worth more than you actually think. That's right. Sometimes we'd consider a king completely useless because it can only move one square nearby and it should always be kept safely behind because we would be afraid of a checkmate. Well, look at this endgame. You'd think that black has a bishop and therefore they should be having an advantage, but that's not true. White is actually winning in this endgame even though they do not have any bishop at all, simply because their king is stronger and more powerful and the bishop is blocked. For example, what can black do? Just stay there with their bishop? We'll just continue here with the king and the bishop will have to go back, or even here, which is even worse. Like, okay, let's go with the other king. And so we attack and the bishop goes here and we come here and the bishop moves and we trapped the opponent bishop. And plus we have a pass pawn. So by the time our opponent actually takes our pass pawn, we'll already capture their pawns, and even though they also took our pawn, we have a passer that is closer to promotion and therefore we win. Rule number 3. Always keep your king in front of the pawn. King leads, pawn follows. Just like here, whenever you are trying to promote a king and a pawn versus a king, you should always keep your king in front. That's how you're gonna win and promote the pawn to a queen. And then win. Checkmate. If you don't know how to do that, I teach that in my school. For instance, in this position, if white does something like pushing the pawn at the same line as the king, they would lose their chance to win, and it would be only a draw. The winning move would be always to go with the king in front, and if black repeats, now we grab more space and we create a path for the pawn. And our goal is actually to control the promotion square with the king. King goes always in front. Rule number 4. Master the opposition. In king and pawn endgames, opposition decides everything. Whoever controls the square controls the outcome. What is an opposition? Basically, it's when one king is opposed to another king and there is only one square in front of them and they are staring at each other. Here white goes king e4, takes the opposition, the king in front of the king. Black king has to move, and it doesn't matter where it moves, white would have a winning plan just by continuing to take more space. And if king goes here on f6, then we take the square on d5, and then they take the pawn, and then we won the game. We're gonna take a deeper look at the opposition, as well as rule of the square, pawn promotion, triangle, shouldering, and many other topics whenever we get to study pawn endgames. Probably you should let me know in the comments down below if you wanna have a video about pawn endgames. In this one in particular, we're taking a deeper look at the overall endgame principles so that you will play them all with your eyes closed. Rule number 5. An active king is a winning king. Always try to activate your king in the endgame, pretty much in any endgame, even when you are down a queen. Just like here. Obviously an exception, but a well-known one. In this position, if you move your king to b6, it turns out that even though black has an extra queen, they cannot go anywhere with it and they're losing the game because checkmate is incoming. Oh, and I almost forgot. If you ever find yourself in trouble, do not forget about the stalemate. Sacrificing the rook to f5, which is a double attack and a fork on the queen and on the king. So black has to take the rook, and voila, we are in the stalemate. Draw. Now, we did talk about the activity of the king, and that is not just for the king. Activity is more or less the basic principle of any endgame. So, in the following examples, we are going to take a look at each piece separately and see how important it is to keep them all active. And one of the reasons why I tell my students they need to study endgames is that specifically in the endgame, you get to truly understand and see the potential of each piece, because you get to learn how to maneuver and win or make a draw, save losing positions with one piece only. Let's start with the rook. Pretty much because Rook Endgames are by far the most popular endgames. So in this position, white is down 2 pawns, but they're winning, thanks to both factors. Number 1, active king, and number 2, active rook. As you can see, the king here is on e6, and the rook is cutting the king by the 7th rank. So a winning move would be rook to h7, threatening a checkmate in 1, and winning the rook, and there is nothing black can do with it. Let's say king f8, and we just check, king moves, and we got the rook. And these pawns, unfortunately, are far not advanced to make any danger. Let's take a look at the next example. There is a very famous saying, I repeat it over and over again. Rooks love open files. So whenever you have an open file, whether it is in the middle game or in the end game, always bring your rook to the open file. Like here, for example, whoever starts gets the advantage because they can get their rook on the open file, and luckily it's white. Rook d1 and king g8. Step number 2. What do you do with your rook when you got the open file? Exactly, you bring the rook to the 7th rank. So here, we attack the 7th rank. We say it in Russian, обжорный ряд, which means the stomach paradise or something like that. So black has to defend the pawn, and then now our winning plan is gonna be to create more weaknesses, a little bit more space. Rook e7, now f6, and now we're gonna simply continue grabbing space, because since we made this pawn push, there is nothing black can do to kick this rook away, because the king has always to protect g7 and the rook has always to protect c7. So a4, king f8, rook d7. You see now king e8 is not possible anymore because of the pawn, so black has to go back, and then white will just bring their king. Could we have done it before? Yes, but grabbing space sometimes is also good because we control the opponent's pawn. So basically the winning plan is going to be a mixture of bringing your king up and also grabbing space and creating weaknesses on the queen side. Let's take a look. King e2, king g8, king d3, king f8, king c4, king g8, king d5, king f8, a5, king g8, c4, king f8, c5, king g8, b4, king f8, b5, king g8, a6. My favorite move because the king is gonna get right inside. D takes a6 and next king c6 and king d7. So what can be better than an open file? Two open files for both of your rooks, just like here. And what would be the winning plan? To bring your rook to the 7th? To bring your both rooks to the 7th rank. Rook c7, attacking the pawn. Rook a b8, protecting the pawn. Now rook d7. Rook f8, protecting the f7 pawn. And rook takes b7. White is winning. Here is another example. Even though white is actually a knight down and we would think that they're losing, they still have a chance because they just bring their second rook to the 7th. And in the minimum here, we're actually gonna make a draw thanks to the perpetual. One more important concept you need to know about Rook Endgames is that whenever you have a passed pawn, you should always put the rook behind the passed pawn and not in front. For example, here once again white is not necessarily in the easiest situation because black has a passed pawn, which is the most extended in the position. And honestly, if we just calculate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So white is a pawn down, but they have a great move here, and that would be to support their passed pawn and put the rook right behind. And now let's take a race. h2, g6, h3, g7, h2, attacking the rook. But we got to queen first, and not just queen, but queen with a check. And white wins the game. Here is one more example. Whenever you get a passed pawn like here, the pawn on b6, the same plan goes for black. If it was black to move, they should have put the rook here on b2, just behind the passed pawn. But thankfully, it's white's turn, so the best move would be rook b1 to put the rook behind the passed pawn, and there is no way black could stop this pawn. If you hurry a bit too much and push the pawn to b7, you would probably lose the game. You're one pawn down because now black goes rook b2, attacks the pawn, and white has no way to protect it, but also white has no way to attack any of the black weaknesses. So therefore the pawn falls, and even black could play for a win. But after rook b1 instead, rook e2, b7, rook e8, but b8 we already promote. They have to sacrifice the rook, but we are the rook up, and therefore we win the game. This is by far my most favorite example of any rook endgames, and I would admit this is one of the most complicated ones. In this position, black is attacking white's pawn on a3. What would you do? Now, as a complete beginner or even a club player, your first instinct would probably be, I need to protect it. But that violates the rule, or actually goes against the things that are recommended. Always try to keep your rook active and not passive. A passive rook is a rook behind the pawn that has to protect it. An active rook is the rook that is attacking. Do not confuse with the rook behind your passed pawn and the rook behind the pawn that is a weakness. So instead of going so passively, white has an active plan. Did you find it? If you haven't found it yet, I strongly recommend you to pause this video. Alright, so here it goes. We're gonna put the rook on the open file and threaten the checkmate. Let's say they do something random like g6. Now, step number 2. We have a simple option that is like probably saving us all the headache, which would be just rook to c3. And now our rook is protecting the pawn, but it's not as passive as an a1, right? It's more of an active rook because we're controlling the open file. Unfortunately, that is not the right move. The right move is gonna be to be active and to continue to look for your opponent's weaknesses and not just your own. So the second correct move here is rook to c6. attacking both pawns. And now one more trap for you. After rook takes a3, which pawn would you take? The pawn on b6 or the pawn on d6? The right solution is actually to take the pawn on a d6, because when the black is gonna attack our b pawn next move, we can grab the b pawn and at the same time protect our own. If you compare it with rook takes b6 first, then black goes rook b3, and we cannot just simply grab the second pawn because we lose our b pawn, right? So you see the difference. Probably one more question. If black plays rook a6, how would you defend or attack? Honestly, you could just take the pawn, right? But if you think about it, you will play b5, attacking the rook, and after capturing once again rook d6, rook b3, rook takes b6, and you won the game. Congratulations! Now let's take a look at our next piece, which is the bishop. One thing you need to know about the bishop is that you should never put a bishop on the same color as your pawns unless you have to, because sometimes your bishop could get blocked, just like here. Black is completely winning because they have an active bishop which is attacking the opponent's pawns, and white is losing because all their pawns are on the same color as the bishop, and even worse, they are fixed. I'll show you another example. Take a look at this position. White is having a much better bishop because all the pawns are on the same color as our both bishops, but it is restraining the black's bishop on b7. So white wins. Simply, we can just attack the pawn and black will have to defend, and then we bring our king. Let's say they are waiting, and then check, and they have to give us the f5 square. Let's say king h6, which is past king f6, and if they do king g7, we can go king f5, they do a waiting move, and then we attack the pawn. They have to go king h6 protect, and then we get inside and grab all their pawns and we win. So if you have a passive bishop, you can also suffer when you're facing the endgame with your opponent having a knight. A knight versus bishop endgames, we kind of already talked about it in my previous video in the real value behind the chess pieces, and here it's more or less the same. We have an active knight which is dominating everything, and a passive bishop, so white is winning, even though they are a pawn down. One more example, very juicy. You see how this bishop is trapped? Basically, this bishop has never been developed, which is sick to realize. Yes, that's it, and the black king never castled short, I assume. Look at this bishop. Even though black has an extra pawn, they're gonna lose this game because not only their bishop cannot move, but also their king. The moment you move, I'll take your bishop and basically just have to sacrifice, but then you lose. Honestly, you just lose everywhere here. Enough about bishops. The knight is our next piece. The knight hates rook pawns, meaning you cannot stop rook pawns, especially when the rook pawns are attacking it. In this position, you have a very nice trick, which is also typical for knight endgames. Are you ready? Sacrificing the knight to g7, attacking both the king and the knight. So knight has to take, and now h6, exactly what I was talking to you about. This is the paradox, something that we're gonna talk a lot in this videos, is when a pawn, a single pawn, is stronger than the knight, because the knight cannot stop the pawn and the pawn is gonna promote. Now your knight is attacked. If you move it, then I push the pawn and your knight is behind and cannot capture the pawn. Ideal situation would be to put the knight on g6, but unfortunately that's not possible. And if you try to stop the pawn with your king, then once again your knight is blocking the way, the king cannot come to g7, and therefore there is nothing you can do here. Continuing forward, center or nothing is our second rule when it comes to the knights. Knights always prefer to be in the center. Doesn't matter where it's an opening and I tell you knight f3, knight c3, and not the knight on the rim as the first lane, but also the endgame. In this position, white has a very tempting opportunity to take the pawn on h7, which is losing, because then your knight would be trapped on f7 forever. Yes, f6 is trapping the knight, knight would have nowhere to go, and then the king would just come and take it. Instead, white should think about how to keep their knight active, bringing it towards the center, and surprise, surprise, we also win the pawn, because the knight is currently attacking the c5, and black has no way to defend it. A knight on the rim is dim, in the endgame, it's a sin. The next piece we're gonna cover is the queen. Similarly, you should always keep your queen active. This is a very simple example of how one queen is dominating another just because it is active and attacking and controlling the king and everything. And black queen cannot do anything, just queen a7 and queen a8 and that's it. The winning plan here would be to create a second weakness though, because one weakness is not enough. So we would try to push the pawns h4 and h5, break this structure, either attack the g6, but when the g6 takes the h5, then with the queen we would win f5 and therefore h5 and e4. And all the pawns will fall. One of the things you need to know about the queen endgames is that you can always try to force the king endgame, which would be winning, right? This is about exchanges. This is basically the reason why we're studying all this basic endgames, where we're trying to get this fundamental knowledge about how to play endgames, is because you need to know which trades you can actually do and which you cannot, because you know the evaluation of the final destination. And here white has an interesting opportunity. First of all, they could just walk with the king away and try to promote the pawn, but then the black queen would try to stop the pawn and also bother you with all these sorts of perpetual checks, which would lead to a draw. But white has an easier solution. Queen f6, not just stopping the check by blocking, but also forcing a queen trade because of the check on the black king itself. So after queen takes, king takes, we would promote the pawn. Here is another example. You'd think that the pawn is about to promote, and that's one more thing. Whenever you're playing queen endgames, the pawn usually promotes if you have a passed pawn, because with the queens, unlike with the rooks, it's super easy to help promote the pawn. So the only chance that black has would be try to force a perpetual check. Just like here. With queen f4, maybe queen c1, maybe queen e3, maybe queen g3 and queen e1, something like that of that nature. Sometimes in queen endgames you should keep your king safe just because you want to avoid perpetuals. Unless, let's say that if the king was already here on c6, then you would need it to win the endgame, right? To promote that pawn, just like in the previous position. White here kept the king totally active. Look, the king came all the way through to help the pawn and the queen, and that was the right plan. But here, there is a possibility of perpetual, so white should keep their king behind. And the only winning plan would actually be, once again, you found it already, I've been talking for too long? Exactly, to force the queen trade by playing queen to f5. And now it's a check and it's attack on the queen. So the queen has to take, but we'll win the pawn, you'd say. Yeah, but what about the other pawn that is about to promote? And I would get my second queen. This is one more example, just simply showing you how whenever your king is in the safe position, the pawn can just promote. I don't know what black would have to do here, but let's say they're just waiting, doing something. Well, then we would just push the pawn, and when the king is waiting, or like the pawn is waiting, then the queen, with the help of the pawn, can continue the invasion of the squares, helping the pawn promote even more, or even easier, just c6, honestly. When the king is waiting, queen d7, and then c7 and c8, nothing can stop us. Honestly, they would try to annoy us, but I believe it wouldn't be as successful. Let's say we push the pawn, they check. We can just go king h3 and then promote the pawn. And finally, we're getting to the third part of our video, must know endgames. Here are a few important things that you need to know about the endgames. Primarily, you need to know the positions that are either winning or losing or drawish. Basically, winning or drawish, because whenever you're losing, you're also winning. Depends on what side you are. So, of course, this one is easy. A queen and a king, yes, they always win. You just need to know how to checkmate. If you don't, you can check that in my school. A rook and a king are also winning. A simple technique can be applied. A king and a pawn, it depends on the position. It depends on the fact if you haven't yet put your opponent's king in that position or not, if you have mastered the opposition or not. If you're still confused in the opposition, let me know in the comments below and I can make a video about it later. Sometimes not all pawns win. For example, here, if it's black to move, then it would be a draw. Or let's say if you have a pawn on the 8 file or 2 pawns in the 8 file, then you cannot win. It's always gonna be a draw. Now, the fun begins. Bishop and the king. This is the paradox. Even though you have an extra bishop, you cannot win if you don't have any other pieces, because you simply do not have any possibility to checkmate. Same applies to the knight. No way, this is a draw. You cannot win if you don't have pawns. 2 bishops. An easy win. Once again, you have the opportunity to make a checkmate. A knight and a bishop, it is winning, but it's a complicated one. You have to know the technique. And spoiler alert, once a world champion did not win with a knight and a bishop. I have tortured several grandmasters into making that under 30 seconds, and some of them succeeded, some not. 2 knights. What would be your guess? You'd be surprised to know that 2 knights are not winning. There is no way you can checkmate. The only thing is, whenever under check and close to the corner, do not go to the corner.
Nobody puts baby in the corner.
Because then, of course, it would be a checkmate. Instead, go to the other side, and then there is no way white could force you to get to the corner. Whenever you have 2 connected passed pawns, you always win. There is no problem with that. The plan is, though, you cannot win just with your pawns. You would have to bring your king towards your pawns to help your pawns promote. Okay? Do not sacrifice any pawns. Instead, bring your king. Let's say they're waiting and you're bringing the king and you're waiting and they're bringing the king and you are here and you took the f5 square and they cannot go to the f5 anymore. So they have to go down. And this is where you go up, you put the opposition, you go here or where, and then you push your pawns. Honestly, here you can even sacrifice like this, because then you push your pawn, and then you push your pawn, and then you help with your king, and then you fight. Okay, this is tricky. You got a bishop and a pawn. Is that a win, or is this a draw? What do you think? Exactly, you're right. It is a draw because the corner of the pawn is of the wrong color. The bishop does not control this corner and the king is close enough to get it. So whenever, let's say, you're trying to bring him somewhere, to push him somewhere, he's just gonna hide in that corner and then there is nothing that we can do about it. This position is gonna be a draw. So if we try to kind of advance, then it's a stalemate. A bishop versus a pawn. Depends where is the pawn, where is the bishop. In these positions, we have another example of the paradox. Meaning a pawn is here more powerful than the bishop, as long as it's white to move. Because we can just move the pawn and the bishop has no way to stop it. By the time we attack this pawn, it's already gonna promote to a queen and we're gonna win the game. How about a rook versus 2 pawns? Depends where are the pawns, but there is a golden rule. If the pawns are already on the 3rd or on the 6th rank, then, believe it or not, they are actually stronger than the rook. Because the rook has no way to stop them. Let's say we're trying to stop them. Let's say we move it here, we're trying to stop it, but they push, and we wait, or we stop it from promotion, and the other pushes, and then they promote. Or, let's say we attack them, and we think, aha, we got them, but no! We promote first, so we capture, and then there is a promotion. God damn it, into check. Whenever your rook is gonna check, you be careful. Do not walk on the g. Be smarter than that. Walk on the e file, and then if you take, you not take. And then the next move, even though we cannot promote, but our thread is actually gonna be to push this pawn, and when they take, promote. 2 pawns, unless there is a particular tactic, 2 pawns are gonna be on the 3rd or on the 6th. 2 pawns are gonna be stronger. This is a funny one. I can give you as many h-pawns as you wish. As long as the king has enough time to be in that corner, it is a draw. And even if, honestly, yeah, even if, oh, nothing happens. Even I can laugh at you and play king f8. And if you move your king here, just being on these 2 squares, actually just this side, this whole side is more than enough. All these 6 squares are gonna be a draw for black. So I can just stay here on f8 and f7. It doesn't matter how many more pawns you have here on the h file, you're not gonna win. And the fun fact is how these pawns have actually appeared on the board, because the g pawn must have taken, the f pawn must have taken twice, and the e pawn must have taken like 3 times. Isn't that hilarious? Anyway, we got 2 more examples. What is that? 5 extra bishops and we still cannot win the game? That's true. Absolutely no way. And even though you'd be asking yourself, how the heck did we get so many bishops? Well, that's because all the pawns were promoted to bishops. Those were B pawn, D pawn, F pawn, and H pawn. Plus your own bishop, that's 5. Mathematically, you can only have 5 bishops of the same color, and it's still not enough to win the game because you cannot checkmate because they only move on the same color. None of the bishops moves on the light squares, so it doesn't work. On that note, let me remind you once again why it is so important to study the endgames. You can memorize 100 of openings, you can spot a tactic or two, but then what? What is the plan? What is the end goal? How do you know what do you trade, what do you keep? Let's be real, if you don't know how to win a winning position or save a losing one, what's the point of even trying? In this video, I have introduced you to the key essential principles of endgames as well as shown you some must-known endgame positions. The knowledge that will help you know where the heck you are actually going with your games. It might feel like a lot, and that's okay. Do not hesitate to watch this video again and again until you finally understand the principles. And if you're looking for more practice, you can join my Endgame Marathon, which is a complete course on endgames which will help you get your chess to the next level. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.